Good afternoon. My name is Jakop from CSIS Security Group, not to be confused with the CSIS that we heard from earlier. We're a Danish-based security company, and we stand for cybersecurity and intelligence services. What I'm going to be talking a bit about today is the trends that we see, the way money gets exfiltrated from the financial sector. The two different things that I'm going to be focusing on is how the bad guys out there target the customers of the banks, and also a few examples of how banks themselves have been targeted. Now, looking at the trends when we look at customer targets, we can't deny the phishing attacks. Now, what we've seen over the past few years is that the phishing attacks is becoming a lot more sophisticated and a lot more targeted. So basically, what we can see here is an example from the Royal Bank of Scotland, where if you look at the URL in the text, the bad guys actually bought a domain which looks very, very credible. So if you are a Royal Bank of Scotland customer and you receive an email like this, first of all, it has your name in the email. It comes from a credible source, rbssecuremessage.co.uk. And the content of the email looks extremely credible. So the likelihood of you actually opening the attachment is a lot greater. This is an example of a TrickBot distribution. And I mean, TrickBot, the gang using TrickBot, they are targeting, they have targets all over the world, but their attacks are very localized. So they customize their attacks based on geographical locations. What happens then when you open the attachment and you install, or the macro within the Word document installs the payload for you, is that the malware itself buries itself deep into your machine, and whenever you log into your web bank or web bank application, it will taste the URL and see which kind of bank you're logging into. It will take over the session. And instead of you ever contacting the bank's page itself, it will do an overlay attack where basically all the credentials that you put into whatever looks completely like your banking webpage will be sent to the criminals instead of to the bank. I mean, this is a configuration file that we've extracted from the TrickBot infection as well. And as you can see here, we have a target in the area region, and there are hundreds and hundreds of different banks implemented in these configuration files. Now, I just want to point out that being implemented in a configuration files, it doesn't mean that your security is poor, that you've done anything bad. On the contrary, actually, it means that your customer base is large enough for you to be interesting to the criminal gangs. I'd say it steals like credentials to your web banking systems. Well, a lot of banks nowadays have two-factor authentication implemented in their system. So, I mean, just harvesting the credentials won't be enough to actually break into the system. I've brought an example today. This is actually from a Danish banking site. We have a national two-factor authentication system, which we use for all of our bank logins, all of our public pages and governmental stuff. So you have either this electronic token or you have a plastic card where you need to use a one-time password token. So basically what happens in this case is, I mean, the malware is already installed in your machine. The criminals have taken over the session. So in order, but they don't have access to your one-time password. So what they do is, when you log into your web bank, you get prompted with the OTP sign-in. And basically what they do automatically and live is that they make an overlay on the one-time password login page, and they have you put in your credentials to log in there. which instead of being sent to the bank, is sent directly to the criminal. Now that doesn't help him because, I mean, you need a unique token sent back to you from the bank in order to know which of the OTPs you need to put into the system. So what the criminal does is he actually opens a session to the bank itself, punch in the credentials that you just delivered to him, and then he gets the challenge response code saying you need to put in the code corresponding to these numbers into your system. So he takes that information, sends it back to the targeted customer, who, none the wiser, punches in his unique code, sends it to the criminal instead of to the bank, who now has everything he needs to log into the web banking application. Now what the customer usually sees then is a spinning wheel or a pop-up message saying that the web banking service is currently unavailable. Please check in another couple of hours while we empty your bank account. CEO fraud is also a huge thing, a huge buzzword when we're talking the security world. And basically, there are two kinds of ways to activate such an attack. I mean, either you gain access to the email services of a target directly, or you can simply buy a type of squatting domain, as we saw with the RBS example, something that looks very, very similar to the actual domain. This is an example I've brought. This was basically a supplier in China, had a Danish customer, and these two people were corresponding a lot about account information and transactions. At some point, the Chinese web server or mail server got compromised. So the bad guys were actually taking over the mail correspondence, sending an email to the Danish parties saying, oh, by the way, we have some trouble verifying the transactions to China, so please use this European account that we made instead. So money was transferred, nobody was the wiser until they received a new mail saying, why haven't you transferred any money to us yet? We then got access, because we wanted to help them in this case, so we got access to the mail server, and we could take all the IPs that were used to log in. We could see there was a lot of logins from China, which makes perfect sense because it was a China-based company. But then we also found 5 unique IPs based in Nigeria. Now, the company doesn't have any work done in Nigeria, so this is obviously the bad guys logging into their system and taking over the mail correspondence. Speaking of gaining access to the systems, the way they use it, I mean, we've all heard about the Dropbox leak, the LinkedIn leak, the Adobe leak, the Yahoo leak. And I mean, a lot of people think, okay, so somebody gained access to my Yahoo mail account, no biggie. But in our experience, people have a very high tendency to reuse their passwords. So your old password to your MySpace account, which you haven't logged into since 2006, might actually give the bad guys access to your either private or corporate email accounts. Now, speaking of phishings, happens when you receive a phishing mail, like the RBS one you had, you get redirected to pages which are completely identical to the service that you're actually thinking you're logging into. These sites are incredibly easy to spoof and easy. I mean, with a few simple tools and clicks, you can completely spoof a website with everything you need to show it like it actually is. I put in the Office 365 last because we've seen a lot of this lately, where you basically get an email from one of your trusted contacts saying an invite to an event or whatever, basically. And in order to see the content of the mail, you have to log into your Office 365 account. We had an example with a fellow who received one of these mails, logged into his system, saw a genuine mail from the guy, but the thing is he now sent his credential to a bad guy who then took over his account, looked through all of his correspondence. Now, this guy was very keen on buying horses, had done so before, so there was a lot of correspondence between himself and his bank regarding large transactions for horse purchases. So what the bad guy did in this situation, he went in, he made an email rule saying that every single mail sent from the bank to this inbox should go directly to the deleted folder. Now he started, on behalf of the guy being compromised here, to send emails to the guy's bank saying that he is going abroad, he just found a new horse that he wanted to buy, so if they could please transfer a large amount of money to this account. And the bank, of course, had to verify that it was good, so they asked him to send copies of his passport in order to verify. Thing is that, well, first of all, the guy who owned the mailbox never saw this because it was sent directly to the deleted folder. And second of all, he had been through the same process before, so copies of his passport was actually in his sent folder. So that was pretty easy to exfiltrate, send to the bank, and then the transaction was done and complete. Now, after the guy here, he had stolen a lot of money. What he did, just as a final goodbye and thank you to the guy, was send a similar mail as the one he had received himself, which compromised him, to every single one of his contacts. So anyone that he knew would receive a phishing mail, which would put them in the risk of a similar attack. Mobile malware is also something that we've seen increasingly. I'd say we had, a couple of years ago, we thought now smartphones are really on the high rise and everybody has one, so we're going to see a lot of sophisticated attacks on smartphone devices. Basically, what we've seen so far is it's nothing more than sophisticated phishing attacks, nevertheless very efficient. So basically you get a text message from your bank or anything saying that we have a secure message for you or anything, and you need to log in here to see it. And when you try to log in, it gets stated that, oh, by the way, in order to read this message, you need to install this updated Flash player, or we won't be able to show you the content. So when you install this malicious application, what it does is basically it just it has overlay permissions. So, and then it has a long list of targets in its configuration files. So basically, when you log into your mobile banking application, it will make an overlay on the application. So whenever you're asked to put in your credentials, again, you send them to the IT criminals instead of to the bank themselves. And usually also, I mean, if you have two-factor authentication, as in the example before, they will also state that we did some updates to the application. We're having some trouble verifying who you are. So if you could please put in your OTP credentials. Oh, and by the way, take a picture of your card with all the OTP passwords on it and send it to us for verification, which people do for some reason. Now, I brought 3 examples of things we've seen that have targeted the banks themselves. First one here, we saw this slide before, which Will showed. I'm going to go a bit more in depth with what actually happened. This was a gang which has been dubbed Carbonara by Kaspersky Security Labs, and this is kind of to show the level of sophistication that we're seeing from the threat actors out there. Basically, these guys who are Russian-based, to the best of our knowledge, they spend over a year doing social engineering attacks, doing spear phishing attacks on a lot of different banks. They ended up compromising over 100 different banks, with a lot of internal employees getting compromised within each bank. So basically, what they did was they infected a lot of machines. They started capturing the screens of everybody who was infected to figure out what did they actually do within the bank. If they were regular accountant, employee, or advisor, or whatever, they would basically just delete the infection again. If they had found a target with administrative rights, they would start looking at how he worked, which system he had access to, how these systems were operated, key logging credentials. So basically, at the end, they had gained access to the internal working systems of over 100 banks worldwide. Now again, this whole thing, it took over a year of planning and execution, and then basically over 24 hours, they exfiltrated money during using 4 different techniques. So either they used the internal systems of the bank to transfer money to US or China. They transferred money from customer accounts to different accounts around in the world. In some cases, they had gotten so deep access into the system so they could actually change the balance of the accounts. So let's say you have $1,000 in your account. They would go and put a 0 on the end of that, so now you have $10,000. Transfer the $9,000 out of the bank into your own system, and there's still $1,000 in your account, so nobody's the wiser. They also gained access to the ATM administration systems, basically sending malicious code to the ATMs themselves. And what we could see in surveillance footage taken from the ATMs themselves was people standing outside the ATMs, just waiting there until they received a text message. Then they walked over to the ATM, which would then just start spitting out money. And over 24 hours, these guys, they got away with over $1 billion in various ways. Another thing we saw about a year ago was, what you might have heard on, was the Polish Waterhole attack. This was another very sophisticated attack, but executed in a slightly different way. So what the bad guys did in this case was that they used a lot of time to figure out which websites the banks were visiting. So they found a page they found a web service in Poland, which was basically a collaborative banking webpage, which a lot of banks would visit to gain information and insights and different kind of stuff. And this page was unfortunately vulnerable. So what they did was they made a drive-by attack on the web page, which basically meant that if you visited the site, it will check all your system for any vulnerable software and try to push malware onto your system. Funny thing in this case was that not only did they compromise the site, they also put in IP restrictions on the download of the malware, which meant that only specific banks coming from specific IPs was actually targeted by this attack. How they chose their target list, we actually don't know, but we do know that it is a pain for security researchers like ourselves when we try to exfiltrate malware by visiting the site, because we don't come from a bank IP, so we were never shown the malware. So it's a very, very clever way of hiding themselves and making sure that they only hit the targets that they actually want. Another fun fact is that we did a lot of research on this, and looking at the security at the source code of the malware itself, it was in most cases written in Cyrillic, so we had an initial idea that it was Russian-based. But when you look at the code as a native Russian speaker, some of the words, they don't add up. So it's basically more of a Google Translate from English into Russian. So they were trying to make it seem like a Russian attack. We then discovered that some of the URLs, some of the domains used in the attack, was also used in the attack on Sony a couple of years ago, which gives some pretty heavy indications that we were talking about the Lazarus group that we also talked about earlier. Third and more recent attack was the Taiwanese Swift attack. Again, very sophisticated spear phishing attack, where by targeting employees working with the SWIFT systems of the bank, gained access to the system and used SWIFT to transfer money out of the bank. Now the moral of this story is that the way they find their targets, and they know who to target, is as trivial as a Google search. Because general people are very happy and keen to tell what they can do on systems like LinkedIn. So a quick Google search will show you exactly who works with SWIFT in different banks, so we know who to target. In this case, they got away with around $60 million. All right, being told I'm running out of time here, so quick summary, if we look into the trends that we need to look out for in the future. I know Will said that the DDoS attack was not something that we saw a lot of anymore. I will still say with the capability of the DDoS attack, especially with the Mirai infection that we have that infects IoT devices, the capability of these attacks are increasing massively, and we have seen different attacks on different financial sectors, which the amount of data that can be sent out can be devastating. I mean, we've seen attacks with over 1 terabyte of data per second being shut off. Ransomware as a service is getting it's getting extremely easy to purchase a ransomware attack. Basically, all you need is an email and a Bitcoin wallet, and the bad guys will do the rest for you. You can tell them how much money you want to get out of this. You can tell them where your targets should be, and basically they will take care of anything for a small percentage of the ransom. Again, the sophistication level of threat actors that we see is increasing violently. Which means that, I mean, all of us have to step up our game and make sure that we are on top of things at all times. Again, sharing information is extremely key here. Phishing campaigns, more targeted, smaller, more efficient, and there's a lot more resources being pulled into these types of attacks. Last but not least, I have a small announcement. Actually, from today, we have in CSIS started a formal collaboration with Anomaly. So in very, very shortly, you will be able to take CSIS threat intelligence and employ it into your system directly through the Anomaly platform. Thank you.